Okay, welcome to this series. I'm David Lane, Professor and Director at Professional Development Foundation. And the purpose of this series is to interview practitioner researchers who have undertaken interesting research with applied ideas that actually are intriguing and we thought would be of interest to you. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stephen Barden as our first interviewee in this series. Stephen is a strategic coach and consultant, works mainly with the corporate leadership sector, and is himself a former corporate CEO. He's undertaken some really interesting research on successful leaders and how they do business with their world. So, welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, David.
Okay, can we just start with looking at what prompted you to undertake this research?
I always trace the spark back to my own failure, actually, which is the last CEO job I did, and I was fired from it. And when I was sort of going through the process after that, I spent a year. I thought, I need to go and find out what assumptions I had going into the job. Why did I behave in certain ways, which in my case was basically looking after the interests of the shareholder rather than perhaps looking after the entire organization, as it were. And I think I called it in the book, why did I slobber all over the hand of the hand that fed me rather than looking after the entire organization, if you like. What assumptions did I hold? So off I went and I wrote for a year. I just sat down and wrote and thought for a year, what assumptions did I have? What did I inherit? Where did they come from, et cetera, et cetera. And that for me was a great cathartic exercise, and it was the spark. I did nothing about it. I then went into coaching, and then about 10 years later, I thought, I really would like to know how leaders experience their learning. Mm-hmm. And because what I discovered when I was coaching was there was a lot of stuff about, what was the impact of leaders, how leaders should learn or should lead, how leaders should act, what is a good leader, what is a bad leader. But nothing was telling me about what was it that made leaders act in particular ways. Okay. What assumptions did they hold going in? So when I started the research, it was literally as bland as how leaders experience their learning. And my assumption again, was how leaders experience their learning while they were in power, while they were in authority, learning under fire, if you like. And it was then that I discovered that as I was starting to do the research, that those assumptions were formed way back, long time before they went into their terms of office, long time before they even went into professional life. And they kept on, whether consciously or not, they kept on throwing open the door and telling me about what they did and what they thought and how they felt when they were children. So that basically was the trigger and what I finally went into.
So what made you commit to the idea of adopting a research approach to look at this rather than just carrying on having a series of conversations? You see many leadership books which are basically just a conversation with a leader and they have nothing behind them.
Because I was really irritated by people saying things like, I think leaders should eat last, and good leaders are humble. And how did they know? I didn't know where they got their research from, and I don't think necessarily they did. I wanted to get a really thorough, rigorous examination of whether, number one, how they did their experience. So that's why I used constructivist grounded theory, because it gave me the ability just to look at the data and, yes, construct the theory out of that, but I wanted to have a way in which I was actually examining rigorously, methodically, how these people who I had selected, and they, by the way, I selected a group of really successful people, and they ranged from being successful because they were at the top of their tree to being spectacularly successful because they had actually changed the way people thought, the way their entire, either in the military or in education or in corporate life, how people thought. So I went in there looking to see how these people, and in a really methodical way, how they experienced their learning and what was it that made them think this way rather than that way. I did not want to go in and make yet more suppositions. I suppose I was saying, if I realized the danger of assumptions without research, then I needed to go and do the research. I needed to actually go and track methodically that research. That's what I was doing. And it was really important to me that when we emerged from that research, there was huge amount of data, which I examined and re-examined. And then, of course, I made life even more difficult by going back to them and saying, is that what you said? Is this theme, do you recognize this theme? So it was particularly rigorous, and it was, yes, it was very rich in its examination, I think.
Okay, so that's what you were looking to find out. What did you actually find out?
Well, what I actually found out was that these leaders, and we can therefore extrapolate all human beings, but these leaders had formed that as they grew up, as they were exploring as children their world, initially their family and later on their environment, etc., etc., they had formed a foundational assumption. They had built up, if you like, a foundational assumption that basically about the power relationship that they had with their world. What do I mean by the power relationship? That they formed an assumption about what they could or could not do within the world through this power filter, and that therefore was the world, how therefore to manage that world, how to make space for themselves in that world. Because we were looking at this particular group of successful leaders, what I discovered, and this really was very surprising to me, was that they all had built an assumption, constructed an assumption that they and the world were in a reasonable power balance.
Okay.
They could, that's where it comes, they could do business with the world. In a sense, the title is quite misleading because, as soon as you look at it, you think, oh, there's another book about, how people do business. By doing business is how they manage, how they deal with, how they interact with the world.
That idea of balance between the world is quite interesting, because if you look at a number of the stories there, these people haven't necessarily come from easy backgrounds in which you'd think, okay, yeah, sure, their life's in balance. They've come from some very difficult backgrounds. Yeah. So how have they come to that kind of idea of balance that they can actually do business with their world?
Yeah, yes, I found that particularly fascinating. I mean, the one person who I call Lennox in the book, it's a mixture of luck and happen chance and all sorts of happenstance and all sorts of things. But Lennox, for example, had come to Britain as a 7-year-old, and there'd been a grotesque mistake made. He had come from Jamaica, and he had arrived in the country. His mother was immediately tried to go and make a living, and knew nothing about the education system. He and his brother were went off to go and register at the local school. His brother was 9 and he was 7. Schools in where he came from, they started school at 7. He had therefore never been to school, didn't even learn to read and write. His brother, who was 9, had learned to read and write.
Yeah.
They mixed up the ages. And they put him, and they decided that Lennox was the older one and the other one was the younger one. So Lennox, of course, was therefore a Dummkopf. He was therefore, as he said, as he put it in his own words, I was classified a thickie. So he was put in to a special needs class.
Yeah.
Because whereas his brother, of course, who was supposedly 7 but actually was 9, was now the genius.
Yeah.
So I said to him, what happened? He said, I just saw it as a mistake. I saw it as a mistake, and I got on with it. But I dug and dug and dug, and what I discovered was where he had been in the island, he had been seen as, if you like, the son of a big man. His father had gone off to the US, to Cuba to work, so therefore was seen as somebody who was too big to be contained.
Right.
And when he and his brother and his mother came to Britain, he saw himself in the same way. So therefore he was not a victim, he was big. Yeah. He was big, he could do business. So he did what his father did. He learned to do business. He learned to deal with stuff. So he was doing things like, for example, since he couldn't be an academic success, he became boxing champion of the school.
Yeah.
He became he built up a community around him. He did that. So whatever he did, his basic assumption was, I can do this because I am not smaller than the world. I am in partnership with it.
Yeah. Okay. What would be the alternative to that kind of doing business with the world?
The alternative, interesting, because I call this assumption, if you like, the foundational assumption, I call the navigational stance, because it is how they navigate with the world, not how they what ends they reach, is how they navigate through it. And so the Lennoxes of the world and all these leaders took a partnering stance. They saw the world as something they could work with. Because if you are on an equal basis, on a manageable balance, it's a waste of energy to do anything other than work with it, because there's a realistic chance you're going to get what you want. The opposite of it is, rather boringly, I call the oppositional stance. Because now, if the world you perceive and you assume the world is more powerful than you, or even less powerful than you, you're going to go in opposition to it.
Right.
The more powerful it is, you think the assumption is going to be, I'm always going to lose at the end. Or, I'm going to have to really battle to find my way. If you feel the world is inferior to you, then there's that balance. The other way, you go, the world doesn't matter. The world doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I really don't have to deal with it. Either way, you're going to ignore it. You're not going to participate in it. You're either going to try and avoid it and escape it because of fear, or you're going to you're simply going to say, right, the world is there to be yoked to my purpose.
Yeah.
So either way, you are not participating in it. For me, it was very much that almost the workable application of being in the world.
Yeah.
The concept of Dasein, of being in the world.
So what you discovered was the importance of this of navigational stance, and how people relate to the world and how they feel they can interact with the world, and, as you say, do business with the world.
Yeah.
as opposed to those for whom the world is a place of opposition and fight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in fact, it seems to be that taking that stance isn't about a reality of I'm actually in a good position or a bad position. It's how they're conceptualizing it, because some of your people clearly were in a very poor position, but
Yes.
nevertheless felt able to find a way to do business with the world.
That's exactly right. Because they realized, and in fact, I introduced the book with the real story with a young man called Michael, his mother would send him off at the age of 4 or 4.5, out of the place they were staying because she didn't want him around. So he'd go down to the local beachfront, and that's where happenstance and luck comes in. He was not abused. He was not taken advantage of because. But he was able to get, he was able to ask people for an ice cream. They gave him an ice cream. He was able to talk to people. He was able to make friends, etc., and then come home safely.
Yeah.
Now, he had been, his mother had been in abusive relationships. He had been treated badly by some of the male figures that came in. However, the circumstances of his life enabled him to understand and to build up this assumption, hey, I can work with this, I can do this, I can, as long as I keep these parameters, as long as I'm able to navigate shrewdly and wisely, I can work with the world. I can work with the world.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at how you actually went about doing this research, because it's fascinating. So, you want to look at successful leaders. So first, how do you find them? And second, how do you get them to agree to participate? And then what do you actually do with them in undertaking this research?
Yeah, okay. So the original thing, and this I always found fascinating, I thought, so who do I want to talk to? I want to talk to, you could see my brain was massively original. I wanted to talk to corporate leaders, successful corporate leaders. I wanted to talk to academic leaders, and I wanted to talk to politicians. And so the corporate leaders I wanted, yes, the corporate leaders were basically, I said, okay, I will go and take a look at people who are global CEOs or international CEOs, people who have authority. That's what they all had in common. They had to have some authority that they, together with their leadership group or whatever, would have enough authority to change, to affect change in their organization. So I went off and I wrote to certain, I had a fairly good network of people that I could go to. And I went and found corporate leaders in Far East, in Europe, and in the US, and that was quite easy. In fact, there was only one person who turned me down very politely, and he said, "Stephen, it's not for me, but here's somebody who will fit the bill." So that they were pretty good.
Yeah.
The academics were also pretty good. And I chose university and college presidents, as well as people who had made a great impact in high school education and their education. And they were pretty good. Then I thought, well, what are the politicians? So I wrote to, and each one of them, I wrote to them and provided a referee or a reference, if you like, that we both knew. So they didn't feel they were going to, jump into. And I did the same.
You did just approach them in coldly, saying, "Okay, okay, fine."
I said the politicians more. So some of them I had known, I had met, but most of them I had not met. But I said, "This is me. This is what I'm doing. You will be anonymous. Everything is confidential. You will not." Nothing will go into be published as research without at least you knowing, and this is the process I'm going to be going through. And here's somebody who knows us both, and we'll will vet that I'm not a complete con man. The politicians, I didn't get anything. I mean, you know, as I say in the book, I didn't get a cold shoulder. I didn't get any shoulder, nothing. And I realized then, because I'd always suspected that, I realized then that really the politicians felt incredibly vulnerable. You know, that this sort of stuff, this was not something that we good. So, and then somebody, as you know, said to me, well, why don't you go for the military? So, and I will be eternally grateful for that. And a former colonel in the army then introduced me to one general who introduced me to another general, and I suddenly got some real stars. I mean, I got some really good people. I also found another general in continental Europe as well, who again, not via this same source, who also particularly good. And so what I then said to them all was, what I'm going to do is I want to interview you, I want to talk to you, I will be asking these questions, and I will be, I will then they will be recorded, the interviews will be recorded, I would then transcribe them, I would then send them back the transcription, the raw transcription, say, is this accurate? They would then come back to me and say, no, you're lying, bugger, or whatever it is. Or they would come back and they would vet it. And then what I then did was I said, and of course the methodology was constructivist grounded theory.
Okay, why don't you explain that a little?
Well, what it actually is it works with the data entirely. I certainly did. I said I was only going to work with the data. I was, as well, yes, of course, there was an acknowledgement within constructivist grounded theory rather than, you know, pure, very tight grounded theory, that, of course, the researcher is going to have, goes in with certain filters. Yes. And so therefore I had to acknowledge and, how should I put it? I had to acknowledge and understand those assumptions and express them, so that we were as authentic and as clear and as honest as possible. But the data, and of course, what it then does, you go through a period of getting the data, looking at the data, and re-looking at the data, almost meditating on it. Then I would code it and theme it in broad themes, and that's what I did. I themed each one, and to see if there was any common currency, and then themed it even narrower, if you like, more narrowly, until we got a coherent narrative out of it, and then I came up with what that narrative was, if there was going to be a model, if there was going to be a theory. On each occasion. So I sent them the raw stuff, then I sent them again the themes, and I said, let's set up a conversation with them. So that conversation was, you know, it was in most cases verbal and my taking notes, but there was also exchange of emails and correspondence in which they commented. And as you can imagine, you know, if they didn't agree with it, or they thought my themes or my postulations were off, they would tell me. Yeah. And they did tell me quite vigorously. And we then, so I themed it, and then more narrow, and then came up with these. What, to my surprise, was a common set of assumptions that they had, right? Okay. Which first were quite clumsy, but then as we conversed, they became more and more refined until we got this set of assumptions, which I eventually called, in the original research, I called it the navigational template, because it was this, but I then called in the book the navigational compass, because it was much more of a directional thing. And now those assumptions are not in any way that they all behave in the same way. Because, for example, you know, one of the assumptions may be socializing socializing the theme, socializing. They like to socialize problems and issues.
Okay,
Now,
can you explain us a bit what socialize?
Well, socializing the file, it comes from, in fact, one of the generals where what he would do before he learned by mistake, if you like, that if you want decisions to be effectively carried out,
yeah,
don't make those decisions on your own. Don't bake them on your own. You need to go and talk to people. You need to go and explain what you're doing. You need to get their buy-in,
yeah,
because if you don't, their assumptions kick in,
yeah,
their oppositions kick in, and you might find a perfectly good decision it's failing because it's just not carried out. So socializing the file was basically ensuring that when you've made a decision, or when you're making a decision, you go and get the buy-in of people,
yep,
all the time. The other one was, and of course, how each of these people socialize the file in completely different ways.
yes,
The other one was pragmatism, which we defined as doing the best possible until the possible isn't best, and then changing the possible if necessary.
yeah, okay,
So working with text and context, and that was another thing that they all did. They all were able, if necessary, to stand the context on its head.
okay. Now you said to some surprise that you kind of found this coalescing. What was the surprise about? You know, why a surprise for you?
The surprise, I suppose, was that there were a number of surprises. One, that the navigational stance, their entry point into how they managed the world, had been with them for such a long time.
Yeah.
And that it had, I could imagine being powerful, but it had been with them for such a long, and remained with them for such a long time. And unfortunately for them, it was a partnering one, but you can imagine that people with an oppositional stance would actually continue looking at the world through the eyes of the child.
Yeah.
Which can be, so that was one of them. The other one was, that my fear was that these characteristics or these assumptions would be a confirmation of the charismatic leader, you know,
okay,
the born leader,
yeah,
which I thought, that's just, I can't have that. Because, you know, it meant that the whole process of coaching, if you like, the whole process of leadership development actually almost falls by the way.
yeah,
Because if I'm a charismatic leader, and all I need to do, as I actually say in the book, then is, if I want to be a charismatic leader, is just imitate the charismatic leaders.
yeah,
You know, and never be but it wasn't. These assumptions were assumptions that were contextualized within each of the leader's own experiences.
yeah, yeah.
So that was a surprise, but it finally was rescued. And I think the biggest surprise for me was how these leaders really kept on throwing open these doors to their childhood without my asking. And I don't know if you have this experience. Sometimes when one does research or one does a body of work, particularly when one is working with data, it remains quite thin. It remains almost quite two-dimensional.
Yes.
And mine was, yes, it was interesting hearing people talking about what they did in their work, etc., etc. But the magic, if you like, the depth only started emerging when they, of their own volition, started talking about their experiences as children and as young people.
Yeah.
That was what made them, that's what they almost treasured more than anything else.
Okay. And you do make the point in the book about you can't simply look at a charismatic leader and pretend to be one. So it's what you got from these people was a kind of genuineness, as opposed to I have learnt the techniques for being a leader.
Yeah.
And therefore, you know, although you mentioned earlier on the title of the book is How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World, sounds like a how-to book, but it isn't a how-to book, because actually it's not about pretending to have the characteristics of a great leader.
No, and that's particularly important, I think, for anybody who's a coach or a teacher or a researcher, is that if we're going to look at leaders, we can't, or in fact, a number of phenomena, if we're going to look at leaders, we can't simply look at the outside, look at the impact, because that means we're saying we can develop leaders by changing their impact rather than changing their underlying assumptions. And I think the important point for me is that if these assumptions are learnt, which is what they are, they can be modulated, they can be relearned, they can be unlearned.
Okay.
Yes, it can be difficult, but they can be relearned, because the adult then can have a new perspective on what she experienced as a child, and therefore relearn. And that to me is leadership. That really is development. That really is leadership development.
Okay. That's probably a good point to start before we go on to talk about the implications of this. So thank you. That was really clear. We'll then go on and talk about, or so what? What are the implications of this research for coaching, for leadership development, for bringing up children even?
Yeah. I think for the implications for certainly for coaching, there's coaching, there's recruitment, there's, to a certain extent, bringing out children, if you like, at least being aware of that. I'm not a developmental psychologist, and my children will probably think I didn't bring them up properly anyway. But I think in terms of coaching, what we can do with this is two things. We can, or maybe even three things. There are always three things, aren't there? We can certainly start by, I developed an in-depth interview structure, which I use with practically all my clients now, in which I go back and discover what is their leadership, their navigational stance. Are they opposition? Are they partnering? What are and then I then test it against the navigational compass, which is these 8 or 9 characteristics or assumptions that the research leaders all had. And what I then emerge with is, okay, so this is what basic assumptions or foundational assumption this particular leader has, and therefore, how suitable are they for that particular job? What do they need to adapt or change to become better leaders, both within the context of that job? And it's important to talk about context, I think, because I don't think that you can get really generic leaders.
Yeah.
A leader in a media company, as I learned to my cost, may be good as a media company, which is very hierarchical, wasn't in the days that I was, not particularly good in maybe a technology company
Oh, okay.
So you need to be able to, but at least with this mode, we can say, okay, if you want to work in a technology company, and you start using these tools, you will become a better leader. You
Right.
will work as a better leader. So that's number one. So it's the enabling leaders.
That's the partnering bit, isn't it? Learning to partner.
Absolutely, absolutely. And partnering, as you know, or with partnering, when you are working with someone, when you're doing this, you have to be incredibly alert.
Yeah.
Alertness becomes the key to everything. You're alert to what's going on. You're alert not only to the text, but to the entire ecosystem, which is the job. You are, one of the leaders talked about being always aware of the rumbling in the ground. He had been a miner, and he always was immensely alert to the rumbling in the ground, as he called it in his job. Generals who are massively aware of the capacity and the appetite of the people around. So that was it became that's the partnering, and that you can certainly enable people to become more and more alert to. So it is developing leaders. That's the number one. The other one is it becomes particularly useful when you do that analysis, that assessment, whether current leaders, how toxic or how benevolent they're going to be. So in recruitment, it becomes important, I think, to be able to say, not just has this leader worked in the industry before, has this leader worked in the academic sector before, but how is this leader going to treat their constituents? How partnering or how toxic are they going to be when they take on the job? I can imagine it would be quite useful for some political parties. So that's the second one. So it's in recruitment and assessing the suitability. And then I think when you're talking about future leaders, you can then say, okay, so as a future leader, let's assess what you are doing now. Let's assess what your assumptions are now. And perhaps we can help break down some of the global assumptions about leaders, about being the solitary hero, or about being, leading from the front, or about, the macho style of leadership, or even frankly, assuming that all leaders have to adopt a coaching style.
Yeah.
Really? Do all leaders have to adopt a coaching style at all times? As I say in the book, when your troops are about to cut and run in panic, do you sit down and teach them to fish?
Yeah.
It wouldn't quite work, I think. So those are the sort of areas you can work with that. And then what I do with what I currently do is, once we've done that assessment, when we're developing leaders or working with leaders, I then will coach them over a series of sessions in which we start to get them to understand what's been going on, what their assumptions are, how they can change, how they can relearn, how they can and how it fits with what they're doing now, doesn't fit with what they're doing now. As far as children are concerned, I think again, an awareness. One of the key things about the navigational stance that they all were given the ability to experience things. Clearly, it is the role of the parent to protect them as much as possible, so that they don't fall off a cliff and they don't get abused as much as possible. But it's important that children are allowed to experience for themselves, so that they can gain confidence in participating in the world. That it's not a case of they becoming self-aware. In my view, and if you follow the model of the book, one is never self-aware. One is aware of the self in the world.
Yeah.
We're never a vacuum. There's always going to be another agent, and the other agent are the people, or the beings in the world. So we need to be able to ensure that children are allowed to experience within reasonable safety, within reasonable security, and to be able then for parents to be alert when they find that their child is becoming more and more oppositional in their stance. So it becomes, I think, at least a starting point to begin to work with children as well, using the model, the filter of power and the filter of the ability. Finally, and this it did not emerge from the book, although I talk about it, funny enough, in a couple of podcasts that I've done, is I think my suspicion is, and this may be the subject of the next piece of work, is that companies, governments, countries also develop a navigational stance. And I use an example of, for example, the United States. If the United States, it's in its formation as a federal republic, assumed that the people in the Native Americans and later black slaves, if you like, were inferior to them, that meant that it was they were by definition working in opposition to what their world is.
Yes.
And that therefore this starts to impact, or this impacted, not only the way they dealt with the whole racial issues in the United States, but also dealt with with their foreign policy, of course, became more and more important. So that, and you see that, and I think, for example, the whole reaction to Black Lives Matter and is something that stems from this basic assumption of opposition that they have within themselves as well as outside.
Okay. Perhaps a cheeky question. You mentioned it a couple of times, kind of learning from failure. So, were you a successful leader as a CEO?
I succeeded in a number of contexts. I mean, I think I was quite good I was certainly quite good in certain stages in my as a media leader, if you like. But no, I don't think I was finally a successful leader. No, I don't. I think I had successes. I had successes, and I had posts where I was successful. But I don't think I was finally a successful leader, and I'll tell you why. Because at the end of the day, what do I define as success, if you like, is the ability to move the entire organization forward. Yeah. The entire organization forward towards its purpose, towards its ends. And I don't think, perhaps when I was not exactly the chief executive, but I was one or two down, if you like. I don't think that I was able to move the entire organization forward. I certainly know that in my last job, I was working in the interest of the shareholder. It's not particularly good. I thought, in other cases, I possibly gave up too easily, but I saw the opposition was too strong in me. Not in me, it's too strong against me. So, no, I didn't move the entire organization forward. No.
I mean, the cliche is that all political careers end in failure. And I wonder, for CEOs, if that you talk in the book about kind of what it means to be successful and the success defined in terms of the sustainability of the organization. rather than the immediate glory of the CEO.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Actually, the way you put it is right. That's success. Did I leave the organization? Does one leave the organization so that it can continue and sustain itself in this culture that you have created? You're going to have failures. There are going to be individual failures. The stock market will go down, or the share price will go down, or it'll lose this customer or this big client or whatever, or it'll as long as it is able to sustain itself going forward, then overall it is a success. The CEO may fall by the wayside. That becomes less relevant. What is more relevant is how have you left a culture? Have you left drive? Have you left a navigational stance that enables this organization to move to sustain itself? That is the question.
Okay, that's probably a good point to finish. So thank you very much for that, Stephen. This is the book, How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World, published by Routledge. You'll find a link to the book and a sample chapter on the PDF website, which is www.pdf.net. We'll also add on there some links to your podcast, Stephen, so people can find them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Excellent piece of research, and I hope the book does really well.
Thank you, David. So do I. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.